So we'd really love to find a time machine like this in 500 years to come back to now, but I imagine myself as a paleontologist come back from 500 years in the future. And that in fact, my job, having only a limited number of years here, is to prepare those specimens to send back in the time machine so that in 500 years, people can look at them and understand what we had. And we have this time machine, it's a museum. Basically, that's my job as a biodiversity researcher associated with museums, to stock those museums, hit the button on the time machine, and get it to go 500 years into the future. Now, this is not a common perspective in science. Those of us in biodiversity research that work in museums know that the specimens pay dividends for centuries, not only in this view of a 500-year from now researcher using them, but we've seen that ourselves. We know that we go nowadays to look at specimens that were collected 200 years ago. So we know that those specimens will not necessarily pay dividends in 2015, but they could very well in 2070 or 2100. The other thing to note is that as we work on our discovering biodiversity, when we discover a new species, that then opens up that species for future studies for the rest of time. So the discoveries that we make, the basic discoveries of finding out what species are in the world, are discoveries that pay dividends themselves for centuries. And the final thing about our perspective as biodiversity researchers is that this effort that we have has been going on for centuries and we're nowhere near finished. So we see the task that we have as being a centuries-long task. So when we ask, are we just an archive? My first response is, even if we were, that's okay. It is so important that we're an archive that we shouldn't try to pretend to be a whole lot else, lest everybody thinks that the all else is why we exist, and then they feel comfortable with abandoning the sense of an archive. And the reason that we feel is that we know in 500 years people will wish we had this archive. The problem, of course, is that this is the context I live, where my neighbor is a molecular biologist, where they're competing with another lab that has to get the results published 2 weeks from now. Otherwise, they lose the competition. Most science wants a return of investment now. That puts us in a tough position in science. Biodiversity discoverers also tend to ask questions, what species are there, that are not fundamentally novel. We were asking those questions 100 years ago, we're asking them now. Even if some of our methods are novel, the questions aren't novel. And the problem is that science usually gets bored with questions that aren't novel, even if we're nowhere near getting the answers. And that's just a peculiarity of science as well as most other fields that have fashions. And the sad truth is that basically right now in biodiversity research, this is where we are. We're basically at the stage of the Valtsier map of 1507. This is about as well as we know biodiversity right now. And so the task is nowhere near finished. So now to think about challenges, okay, as somebody with a museum in biodiversity research. We have to worry about security against many things: dermestids, silverfish, ultraviolet radiation, thieves, and administrators. And by administrators, I'm thinking in the context of a bigger institution that has to decide where to put its budget, and administrators who don't have this 500-year perspective. And what happens to what administrators think, seeing something like our museum, is to think, and I'm not saying this of anybody at UBC, because in fact, but it has been a trend all across North America. Universities have been disbanding their natural history collections. It's a very common thing. And what the administrator thinks is, well, it doesn't seem to be paying dividends this year or next year, so we should give it to a bigger museum. So the deaccessioning is in the style of consolidating with larger museums in Washington or Ottawa or whatever. My own feeling about that is that it's, in some circumstances, it may be the only thing to do, but there are two reasons that it's bad as a general trend. One is the wanting to have multiple baskets for your eggs. And the other is that if there aren't local museums, then there aren't going to be young people stumbling into them, getting a passion for the discipline, getting a passion for the subject, and deciding to study it. If everything's centralized in one place, hidden away, there will be no new minds coming into the field. So I think it's really important to have a dispersal across areas of museums. Okay, so thinking a little more concrete about our challenges as a new museum, we're transitioning from this series of scattered collections into a single one. Because of this, we don't have formalized policies of most sorts. We don't have formalized deaccessioning policies. We don't have consolidated loan policies and so forth. The other thing that we're doing is, in the past, as a series of scattered collections, they were mostly maintained by either volunteers or underpaid people. It was very spotty as to how well they were maintained. And so from being a neglected set of collections to a set of collections that's now the focus of attention is a transition that's going to be very hard in terms of dealing with staffing. We have to move 2 million specimens, and we have to go public. And that last thing is a very new thing for us, and it's something that we're going to have to figure out how to do. So we aren't just an archive. We do archive, we do research, and I think it's important that we maintain active research to keep the vibrancy in the collection, and we have to educate. And here's the two things about education to think about. We at least have to educate, if only so that society knows to invest in us as an archive. But we also have great minds who can talk about things that matter. And in our case, it's biodiversity. So just to tell you a little bit about our outreach program and exhibits, which is just getting going, we have the constraints of very limited square footage, because most of what we have in square footage is taken up by the research collections themselves. The staff is very small, but we do have some important assets, 2 million specimens, world-class biodiversity researchers, and great staff, although they're few. And so our question is how to have an impact on public education appreciation with modest resources. And I'm just going to take you on a really quick tour of what it's supposed to be going to look like. This is our atrium. On the left is the start of the collections cabinets that extend back there. This particular rendering was done before the cabinetry was finally designed, and it turns out that we're not going to have such visible windows to the collection, not so many. The collection will be explorable, the research collection, but to the extent that you can walk down the aisles, most of the cabinet doors will not be openable, but there will be displays embedded in cabinet doors, for instance. Here's just an example of what the cabinets now look like without the correct lighting and without labeling and so forth, but you can see that there's some windows into the collections. We will have a small auditorium as well as a room for workshops and labs doing hands-on things. And finally, these are the basic principles we've put together for outreach and exhibits. One is that we have to emphasize authenticity, real research collections and real biologists, but we don't want to be too geeky because we want to be able to communicate and build passion, so we want to communicate both science and beauty. And of course, many of us in this field got into it because of the beauty. And so we want to talk about biodiversity not just through the eyes of science, but also through the eyes of art. We want to target children and teachers because, of course, that's where the future is. We want to offer human contact in a community because we know that to make passions build, it's important to have a sense of community, to offer that, to have human contact. So we're going to emphasize workshops, lectures, and events. The other reason for that, of course, is with limited square footage, we can make a lot more happen if we have people involved than just dioramas. We've got great researchers in the back of the house, and they have to be brought to the public. It's one of our best assets. And the other thing is we want to feel like we become a home for communities of enthusiasts. And this comes to our last point, is since we do have limited staff, we can't hope to do everything ourselves. And so we want to be a catalyst to whatever extent possible. And the two examples of that are to be a home for communities of enthusiasts, so they can spur each other even if we're not directly involved, and also the teachers, where one single action on our part can generate many good results.